3, 2, 1. Okay. Point of framing and then 4 points constructive. So I think like for definition, like large US city can just be any urban area with over 500,000 people. Like essentially, like, you're New York, you're like Chicago, you're like San Francisco, Los Angeles, like Baltimore, Pennsylvania, like all that stuff, right? And I think when we say like they're governed in unaffiliated multi-party political systems, there's probably like broadly looks like a bunch of different parties either responding to specific issues in the city, or it can be like a lot of like more small grassroots parties, or it can be like individual parties that tend to have like specialized political beliefs that may be more broadly like representative of like your typical coalition government, right? It probably is a mishmash depending on each locale, and I think it's unfair to like say one model is going to be the most common one because each city is going to be very different in its individual beliefs and its individual specificities. Anyways, that being said, why is it actually better to have like these multi-party political systems? First thing, I think single municipalities will often have very divergent needs and incentives from a larger region, right? In their status quo, note that Republicans and the Democrats tend to largely be like big tent parties that have to rely upon specific large voting blocks keeping them in power. The Republicans, for example, need the Christian right to back them, and they also need like the wealthy elites to back them, and they also need, for example, like more conservative middle class white Americans to back them. Democrats need like urban professionals to vote for them, and they also need primarily people like within inner cities, and they also probably need a lot of people who are like like middle class educated like white collar workers. Well, this is, and also blue collar workers too, like in like Pennsylvania and like Wisconsin, whatever else. This creates an issue, right? This then means that these parties have to consistently try and appease everyone within them, which tends to significantly limit their ability for them to take direct action on really pressing issues that might be really urgent for a city, but that might be politically unpopular, right? So for example, with Democrats, when it comes to things like safe injection sites in San Francisco, which has like a terrible opioid crisis, which badly needs to like stop the spread of HIV among used needles, for example, but like it's unpopular among like the more centrist like blue collar workers that depend upon in swing states, they're really hindered from doing that at a municipal level because they don't want the narrative to be in the media that they're giving away free drugs. I'll take you later. Anyways, and similarly, like Republicans, after like trying to solve like a housing crisis in Texas, they don't want to be like, oh, they're making the 5-minute city in Texas and they're going to take away your cars and make everyone communist. Like this is like not actually pretty close to what the narrative can be, right? But oftentimes it might be a legitimate solution certain Republican cities will use to solve housing crises, like rezoning single-family homes, right? So this means that people who use like these municipalities that have like Republican Democrat mayors are very, very like constrained by the actual like political maneuvering of the parties they're part of. Counterfactually, when we have individual municipalities, I'll take you later again, when you have smaller like grassroots parties, they're a lot more effectively able to respond to individual needs to create parties that are either A, predominantly focused on solving a certain issue, or B, that spend much more of the time on solving that given big issue that comes up, right? So this might be like, again, in San Francisco, it could be homelessness. In Texas, it could be like gun violence. In like New York, it could be like, whatever, like, I don't know, making the subway like less dirty, like, whatever happens in these big cities. Second thing too is I think large parties are just like really impossible to get in contact with and really hard for your average person to reach out to, right? I think under the status quo, large parties, again, have to have layers of bureaucracy at every level, right? There's like an army of consultants that has to go through to get any like rubber stamp on anything. This is necessary given with 1, really large and bureaucratic, 2, you have to appease a lot of different people, 3, it's like really, really hard to manage all the elaborate finances and the fundraising and the directorship and like the canvassing for like an institution this massive to also ensure that like there's no legal liability issues, to ensure you don't piss other people off. So it becomes like really, really hard for you as an average person in a municipality to have any point of contact with like Democrats or Republicans, right? It's pretty fair to assume your voice is pretty fairly relevant, and that if there is actually an issue that arises in your community, it's going to take a long time to actually have anything done because there needs to be multiple layers of approval before any actual material policy is done. Counterfactually, these smaller parties, but A, they have a proactive incentive to care. They're more effective by individual votes just on like a per vote basis. Like it matters a lot more to them if they lose like a certain city ward than if the Democrats do, right? They care a lot about that then and have a proactive incentive to ensure that each individual city ward or whoever else votes are split up will vote for them. Second, I think they also tend to have more localized support networks, right? They're actually just known, like like I don't know, like Bob from like 2 streets over who you've went to high school with and who you can like call up if you don't like what he's doing, right? You actually have a much easier ability to access these kinds of parties and like air your grievances out to them, right? 3, I think they also tend to be from your community, right? And I think to the extent that they're going to be like someone who grew up in your community, probably in your wealth class, probably from the same background as you, they're probably a lot more likely to have sympathy and understanding of what the issues are, right? They're not going to be some like fucking McKinsey consultant who went to business school. They're going to be someone who actually grew up around you and knows your family and knows the kind of issues that you're affected by, right? And I think it's more likely they're actually have an incentive to care, right? I think it's also more likely divided issues relevant to population, right? Like in Toronto, people are mad as fuck about Ontario Place. People are mad about the fact that the TTC has like shut down a new subway line and the Ontario line's taken 10 years, and mad that we have the worst traffic in the entire world, and mad that like our subway is kind of mid as fuck right now. And if there's like parties that are able to like appeal to those issues, it's a lot more likely that like if they were running on that particular issue, they'd have more of an incentive to respond to it because their success is electorally hinged on solving that issue, right? And I think it's likely that parties will respond that way. I will take opening.
So if splitting once gives people votes, why just stop there? By your logic, we should have a separate party for every neighborhood, every church, every cycling club. At what point does the ballot?
Well, because the thing is, municipalities, it's just like how like power is divided. Like municipalities have certain things they're allocated to do, like garbage collection, wastewater management, like zoning laws. Like there's actually specific legal allocations are given under both the American and Canadian Constitution. I think it's pretty straightforward. That's why neighborhoods don't. It's why we have municipalities and not like fucking communes. This is a silly question. Anyways, better diversity. I think it's bearing in mind a lot of American cities tend to be like predominantly racialized. They tend to also like there tend to be cities that have like demographics that are different from the broad majority of the population, right? This is like cities like Baltimore that are majority black. It's cities like Los Angeles that are majority Latino. It's cities like the Bay Area that might be majority Asian. And because this then means that they might have specialized needs or they might not feel like they're represented more broadly by the individual political party they're part of, right? What this then means then is when you have people coming from these communities, they actually, again, they understand and they sympathize a lot more with the background, and they also like are more likely to actually like raise the issues like of that particular demographic within the city. It's a lot more likely that they're going to do things like, maybe enact things like sanctuary city policies. It's a lot more likely to do things like, be more concerned about hate speech or like hate crimes in that particular region. I think it's probably better for just getting representation too from those demographics. It's a lot more likely they're actually from that background. And I think diversity like from a neighborhood is probably pretty good if you probably want your representatives to like actually like match like the experiences and values of that neighborhood. Fourth thing, I think it's less likely that Republicans get mad at you. Like consider that like as of right now, Republicans are threatening to cut off like it's funny like every Democratic city, right? The narrative the Republicans have is like, California's falling apart because the Democrats are letting San Francisco run afoul with thieves, right? And they're going to cut funding off now. It's a lot more likely the Republicans don't want to do this because they don't want to piss off individual cities. The narrative right now is Republicans say, hey, we can replace your incompetent mayor with the Republican mayor and they'll do a better job. Counterfactually, on our side of the house, what happens instead is the narrative becomes, hey, fuck you, San Francisco, we're cutting off your funding. And it's a lot more politically unpopular to actually be like, hey, this entire city-based municipality we're beefing with. It's a lot more likely that it becomes seen as like a regional-based conflict, and the Republicans have less incentive to do that because it alienates voters exclusively as opposed to being something they can justify from an ideological lens. I think it's a lot more likely that you can secure funding. It's a lot more likely cities can do things like sanctuary cities, like safe injection sites, so on, that are politically popular Republicans so proud to propose.
This debate isn't about which side gets better regionalized politics. You can already do this when you have more broad national parties. There are two structural reasons for this. The first is that independent, mayors have to appeal to their localities. They will be punished by people if they don't listen to attentive local issues. This is why most mayors that get voted out are people who seem out of touch with the public. So you have to put in the grunt work, talk to local communities, and fine-tune things like zoning bylaws to whatever city you live in. So you have you have organic incentives to care about local issues. The second is that there's just no reason for the national to crack down at the local level. So George's assertion is that the national level broad political parties allow for less local flexibility. But a lot of the times, the local flexibility doesn't mean, you have to come at the cost of the party's ideology. There's no reason why the Republican or Democrat Party cares so much about how many parks you have, or about your particular zoning bylaws, or about, how you are doing things like transit. These are not the, be-all, end-all, endogenous, ideology claims that these parties care about. But secondly, it is quite good for these national parties to have responsive local mayors. If you are seen as a good mayor who listens to your people, and this reflects well in the party, there's no reason for you to have this level of specificity. This is not what the debate is about. We think what the debate probably is about is having, more parties that are, a mishmash of different ideologies. And we're happy to have fewer parties. We think that parties are only good insofar as they have good policies, that they are representative, and they are good at making decisions. We are going to prove why none of these things happen on their side. The first argument I want to run is about misinformation and poor decision making. Note that these parties are independent, which means that they have no established history. We essentially know nothing about them. We don't know what their party line is. We don't know what their ideology is, which means that we are forcing individuals to have to do more research about the party platform. This is a burden that they're not likely to take on. comparative here is you know a lot about established parties. You know that they have distinct lines, they have coherent ideologies. There are colors you associate with them. You see clips of them on national news networks, and thus you have more information. You know broadly that Democrats are pro-welfare, they like social issues, they like the working class, and Republicans are physically conservatives, they're pro-meritocracy and anti-EDI, which means that on their side of the house, you're far more likely that people vote on arbitrary measures because the average person does not have a lot of time to research all these independent parties or even get a sense of what their white papers say or what their party platforms say. So you have more potential for misinformation and the non-credibility of promises, given that most people don't gut check or fact check these claims and they're listening to these claims at face value. I think that, on the other side, big parties are beholden to their party lines. You know what they're going to do. You know that they have directives from the national, so your decision making is significantly better. Note that this is not a solvable issue because most people learn information about voting through third hand. Your knowledge about US politics of the average US citizen is very, very low. The reason for this is first, newspaper and subscriptions usually report things on the national level. The gutting of local level newspapers means that you don't know a lot about municipal issues. So people know about broad national politics, like the left versus the right, but it costs more to purchase the local newspaper, and it's often drowned out by things like the Washington Post, who have no incentives to report that much about your local city election. But the second is the slashing of funding to the Department of Education under Doge. There's no way for people to get more politically literate on these particular niches because there is no incentive to fund school boards to make people literate in such a way. The weighing here is then on breadth. Many people live in these areas. We think it is quite substantially bad that they are less able to determine their futures based on less information. The likely outcome is one, they choose not to vote because they are very confused as to what all of these parties represent, or they vote very poorly, which really matters since these are the areas that really affect your life, right? It affects your life whether or not a party decides to build a park in your local area. It affects your life when a party decides on transportation, and you are not able to meaningfully make these decisions if you can never really get this information in the first place, and you can't sort through all of their lives. Second claim, this creates more noise that causes gridlock and makes it more difficult to make decisions. I want you to weigh on government's best case. Either you have 2 or 3 big parties. This is just indistinguishable from status quo, because if you have 2 or 3 big parties, they probably organize themselves on the same lines as the national, but they're just less reliable and you have less information about them. So you recreate a process that already currently exists. Or you have much more political parties that have less know-how and have divide and conquer strategies. What does this look like? We think that independent parties have really strong incentives to divide and conquer along identity lines, and this is far worse with independent parties than with national level parties. I think first, it's because many more parties are likely to run, which means that people, given they do not have the ability to express policy nuances in a way that is clickbaity and instantly appealing to people, have to differentiate themselves on separating people based on racialized or gendered or class lines. This is much worse than if you have a national party, because when you have 2 large parties, you aren't really trying to pit minorities against each other, but rather you're trying to divide and conquer on far broader party lines because you can get many minorities under the same messaging. But when you have many smaller parties competing, right, there is an incentive for differentiation. You need to make yourself different from all the 5 dozen other, political parties running out there. So you all have to pick a minority group or, a gender class to appeal to. So the need for differentiation creates the need to create more hatred. But I think second is that identity is a simple and easy rallying cry. In the absence of, coherent political and party ideology, you default to what people are secondarily more familiar with. Before that, closing. Aubrey.
Yeah, so you hinge your case on voter identification with information, but the issue with this is that turnout to primaries is incredibly low, and
That's literally false, dude. Primary turnout in New York is, I think, in some points higher than the national election. Turnout is high, but the people voting make a lot stupider decisions. That's really bad. We don't want people to make stupid decisions about their lives. The second reason is that identity is a simple and easy rallying cry. It's far more tangible than policies that you haven't enacted yet. You don't know how they're going to perform on the policy record, which means it's far easier to appeal to stereotypes, to appeal to existing hatreds. We think that this creates much more division amongst these cities, especially since large cities tend to be places where there are many minority groups, right? There tend to be Chinatowns, there tend to be groups of Indian immigrants. These groups are now going to be significantly more angry with each other because this is how small parties differentiate themselves. The final quick claim is that this is actually exclusionary to middle and lower lower class candidates. The reason for this is when you are a candidate with a national party, the national party is able to subsidize you with all of their riches. This is quite good because this means to get a platform, you just have to be an appealing candidate. You have to be smart. But on their side, you not only have to be smart, you have to have buttloads of money. We think it is bad to select for an elite class of politician that is really wealthy and is out of touch with the working class.
I'm going to do some broad rebuttal, and then I'll get into rebuilding, and then some new constructive material. Firstly, on rebuttal, the first thing that they say is that there's unlikely going to be a lot of pressuring of national governments onto municipalities in the first place. They're not likely going to care about zoning laws. George's argument is specifically about things like crisis responses, where governments have incentives to federal governments have incentives to portray local municipalities in negative ways, insofar as it's more likely, for instance, that people vote in their party lines for the next election in terms of the electoral college, federally, for instance, or putting in a Republican mayor in the next election cycle. So this claim still stands in many instances. The first prop claim here is in terms of why misinformation is likely going to happen to a very large degree. I have a few responses to this claim. The first is just mitigation. This is a very short-term harm. That is, when new parties get created, this is probably going to be something that people don't have a lot of information, but 2 or 3 elections down the line, I think people have generally ideas of how these parties act, especially when they have already been in power for an election cycle in the very first place. The second thing we say, though, is that we think that parties have incentives to communicate themselves in very clear ways so that people know what they actually stand for. The reason to believe this claim is because, as they say, if you don't know what the politicians themselves are supporting, then you're not going to vote in these elections in the very first place. So presumably to capture voter bases, you see things like social media infographics that are posted everywhere, which are accessible to everyone, which is what is likely going to exist when you have new parties that get created. I want to note the comparative here then, because perhaps there's going to be a little small group of population that is not going to know about these elections for the first or second election that happens down the line. On their side of the house, you have significantly less choice in terms of who you want to select in office. Potentially, you don't believe in the Republicans' abortion policies, but you don't agree with the Democrats' drug injection sites policies as well. In these instances, it's unclear who you should actually support. There's not a large enough, there's no one that you can actually support and represents your political ideals. We think that political parties are good on a federal level insofar as they aggregate preferences. But we think oftentimes local preferences in big cities are significantly more different from those of federal preferences, which is why these parties do not aggregate the preferences of local political parties. And so therefore we think we access democracy significantly more on our side of the house. Sure.
This point is strange. Do you believe that Democratic Socialist running for leader of the Democratic Party of New York City, Zoran Mamdani, is going to behave the same way as right-wing centrist Andrew Cuomo should one of them win the primary?
Yeah, this is an exception. I'll get to that. The second thing that they explained to us is in terms of why gridlock is likely going to happen significantly more. I would know that gridlock is probably unlikely going to happen. I think there's probably going to be some degree of parties, but given that there's just a lot less bureaucracy involved, i.e. there's 25 cities, 25 spots in a mayoral city, I think it's significant. Just the amount of people means that it's significantly more difficult to do things like have this immense amount of political gridlock that slows things down to a very large degree. I think giving people the amount of choice to select who they want as politicians is more important on our side of the house. The last thing that they say is politicians are going to act in harmful populist ways by operating on the basis of identity in many instances. I would note that this is actually politically unstrategic for political parties to do on their side of the house. And the reason to believe this claim is because we think that the reason why these types of parties work on a federal level is because these population bases, there's a lot of minorities spread across the country. On their side of the house, for instance, if there's one large group of minorities that exists within the city, it becomes strategically unpopular to have a bunch of different political groups for a bunch of different minority groups. At the very best case, it's maybe one political party that operates for the largest minority group in this country, but at the same time you're alienating every other voter base. And definitionally, minorities are the smaller population in the society, so it doesn't make sense for politicians to actually appeal to these groups on their side of the house. No. Actually, yeah, sure.
How many parties are going to run?
I don't know, it depends on the city, right? I'm just saying it's probably not going to be an infinite amount of parties as you suggest. It's probably going to be more than 2. Yeah, okay. Cool, moving on. In terms of minority candidates, and this will deal with the Andrew Cuomo POI. I think that what ends up happening in many political parties, in many cities, is that minorities get significantly unfairly represented in many offices. So we think that the people who get the institutional support in many instances are people who have party backing or have who have insider information, who've been involved in the party significantly more. So if you take a look at the New York Democratic primary, although it's an exception that Zoran has so much support, the party is most of the elites within the party are supporting Andrew Cuomo because he is the insider in this instance. We think this is true for like most parties in the country. And so even though minorities can run, they get politically disenfranchised by the other individual who is supported by the political elite in many instances. What necessarily happens on our side of the house, though, is we have a lot more diverse political parties that are likely going to spring up towards caring about a lot of local issues. So if individuals, for example, prefer minority candidates, they have higher abilities to access and vote for these individuals, and we're able to meet these preferences significantly more on our side of the house. There's two impacts to this claim. Firstly, I think it's that there's significantly more ability for minorities to actually access a lot to access a lot of spots to access like positions of power in society. Their claim is that but poor and middle class individuals are politically disenfranchised. This directly takes down this argument by explaining why in the status quo through Democratic and Republican, this structure, they are already disenfranchised insofar as they don't get selected to be the political primary in most amounts of instances. They can play example tennis, but that's not structural mechanisms. The second thing is we actualize the preferences of individuals in society. That is, if they want a minority candidate, we give them that option when Democratic and Republican parties don't want to run these candidates in the first place on their side of the house. The last thing I want to point out here is that we think that small parties have significantly more incentives to try out different types of policies. So for instance, there's likely going to be single issue parties, for instance, on things like UBIs, for example, or like injection sites on our side of the house. Necessarily, these probably get elected when people are tired of traditional forms of political parties, and these forms of traditional policies don't actually work in the very first place. The reason why this is necessarily good is because we think that these municipal changes can oftentimes spearhead policy changes in other areas. So policies that have significant amounts of research backing, for instance, but are electorally unpopular, if people give these a chance because they are tired of political institutions, like the traditional political policies that get implemented, you necessarily have a creation of new political policies that is beneficial for individuals all across the nation. So for instance, with South Korea, when South Korea replaced their highway with a walkway, this was seen as very unpopular at the time, but it actually reduced the amount of traffic rates that existed in South Korea because people just started driving less and they started using public transportation significantly more. We think these solutions are likely going to be beneficial for people all across the country. The reason why we should care about voter preferences is because states have a monopoly of violence on individuals. They can arrest you and they can tax you. And we think the only way this power is justified is the point at which individuals have the most amount of choice that they have within their political systems, and we allow that uniquely on opening government.
3, 2, 1. One piece of engagement to OG, then 4 different pieces of matter that I think are just going to extend on our case. The first thing I want to engage with, I think, is the premise, which is just multi-party local elections give all these communities their own voice. So city policy finally reflects true diversity, and this is good. Which I think is the premise of a lot of the things that underline OG. Obviously, they do this with a lot more nuance in different ways. 4 different responses. The first thing is I just think this is massively, massively assertive from OG. Because they assume that better representation just happens because more logos appear on the ballot. But there's a missing context where it's most mayoralities will still stay first past the post. So if you have 5 candidates, 32% of the vote still wins. So it means that fewer voters end up getting represented, I think, in the long run if you have more parties. 2, their burden is incorrect because the diversity of labels doesn't mean that you get a diversity of outcomes. What actually matters is the policy adoption. So things like eviction defense funding, language and access ordinances are already delivered, by the way, by coalitions inside of one big tent party. But the things that they want don't actually have a pathway to actualize just because the party that wants them exists, as they say they do. But 3, and I think this is important, is I want to flip the principle on them, and I'd point out that there's an adverse effect underneath OG that's quite important, where it's to say that if you have black and Latino blocks split against 3 micro parties, it means the old homeowner party, the ones that do the bad things, that supposedly push out all the bad rhetoric that they say exists, just wins with lower turnout plurality that ends up being split amongst many different parties that have many different things. So that's voter dilution that's likely to exist as a harm. The 4th thing that I'd say is what Emily says, which is to say that if a policy is likely good, it is likely palatable, there's no reason why it doesn't exist on our side of the house anyways, underneath the Democrat that exists anyways. And this is quite important because the saying that the New York Republican is a Texan Democrat, I think rings true here. There's obviously reasons why they change and what their overall opinions are and what the sorts of things that they preach depending on where they are regionally. I don't think OG has a sufficient response to that. I think that takes out the bulk of their case. First thing that I want to extend on is the stuff that Emily talks about in terms of making parties more equitable, specifically from an information perspective. Because I think Emily does it really well, doesn't really have a response about why heuristics for who you vote for are likely to be easier on the side of the house. And I'm going to point out 2 more things that exist underneath this. The first thing, and this is also responsive to OG, is that local-only parties multiply and morph and have an incentive to do so. If you look at Montreal, they've seen 5 major municipal parties dissolve dissolve, merge, or rename in 30 years, but now immersion this churn in Atlanta or Phoenix. And this means that it isn't just 5 years of not knowing who the next party is, it's a very long-term consistent shift of local parties consistently shifting and changing things. There are two reasons why this is true. The first is that their funding pipelines tend to be not consistent. They tend to be put in place by people who are rich, who actually agree with what the party pushes out. Which means that when your rich billionaire daddy says, no, I don't like you, I don't want to exist with you anymore, it means that your local party has to look for other forms of funding. Comparatively, by the way, this never happens because the Democratic Party or Republican Party in the US is so massively wealthy and they want their candidates in every single city that they always have a consistent form of funding from the National Party unless they go really massively offside. But if they were to go offside, they wouldn't run as Democrat or Republican in these regions anyways. So it means candidates and the sorts of parties that exist are likely to be more specific and not change out every 5 elections. The second thing that I'd say under here is that media and civics gaps hit really hard when turnout already lags. So just to say, even if you buy their claim that turnout isn't high, which it isn't by the way in most major municipalities, what is true is that lots of metro dailies don't talk about the news that much in 2004. TV stations talk about crime, it's not that they talk about the news. They don't talk about politics as much. They cover crime substantially more rather than community votes in places like New York, which means that there isn't anyone left to decode, I don't know, I'll say 4 new parties even, like let's be charitable. They exist, 4 new party manifestos for people who are like Spanish-speaking service workers who have split shifts anyways. Community organizations will try to fill in the gap that exists with the media, but they'll spend a lot of their time canvassing, trying to explain who is who as opposed to what the actual issues are. There are 2 distinct impacts from this information stuff. 1, obviously there is selective demobilization. Turnout will drop disproportionately in Black, Latino, immigrant, and youth precincts, which means a lot of power in a lot of cities gets redistributed towards high information, high income homeowners, which also subsequently implies a policy shift in these cities. That's to say, city councils will reweigh budgets towards NIMBY demands, things like property value defense and policing, and they'll starve redistributed projects as a result, because these projects require coalition voting and combos across all of these different parties, which means it's harder to go for. But the second thing, intuitively, is I just think you get less democratic legitimacy. Just for the simple thing that you have less engagement with the system, people's votes don't translate into people they see, so people see City Hall as more arcade and remote. New extension, why new national parties tend to be more efficient as a result. There are 4 different ideas here. The first is that you just have more economies of scale technologically. That's to say the DNC has the boost voter file, the RNC has data centers. These cost tens of millions to build. A New York only file or a Houston only file of comparative quality would bankrupt the vast majority of municipal parties because these are long-term projects that capture censuses of anywhere. Maybe the response from Gov goes, but like, no, why don't they use them? Here's the problem. The problem is that they may lease them out to you, but the difference between you being a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate is that you have to pay sticker price or go without. So it's substantially more financially prohibitive and is another reason why municipal parties financially are set up to fail when they don't have the bulwarks that exist from these sorts of systems. 2, talent pipelines are substantially more efficient on our side of the house. That's to say that future city controllers tend to cut their teeth as Democratic legislative campaign fellows. Campaign managers learn compliance rules in congressional races far before they come home. When you break the ladder, you leave a lot of open seats to either hobbyists or machine brokers, which is just probably bad because we want people who understand policy and understand how the bureaucratic regime works, which they tend to tell as bureaucracy bad. But the reality is that bureaucracy good oftentimes creates a lot of safety nets for people, and it's good that we have people who know how to navigate them, not just random hobbyists who say, I can win an election, I can run it, and engage and fill up these seats. 3, I already talked about the fundraising stuff. 4, just a general thought about this is it's like, I had this thought, I don't really know how to expand it, so I'm going to try to do it really briefly, is that there's probably something to be said about policy tank spillover. That's to say that if Congress debates things like the Inflation Reduction Act, climate-minded mayors get the memos from this, they get model ordinances, and they get access to the same economists who wrote the federal bill because they share a party network. So what this means is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you try to solve an issue in your city because you have an access of information. So federal issues that are somewhat relevant become far more prevalent on your side of the house. There are 3 different impacts here. 1, administrative capacity on their side, I just think falters. It falters because you don't have the same staff, you don't have the same tech stacks, you miss statutory deadlines, cities are worse. 2, and more importantly, there's a higher entry barrier for outsiders. Wealthy self-funders, legacy interest groups fill the organizational vacuum, which means politics is less open and not more, and they run out of money real fast. 3, policy diffusion stalls. And this is quite important, because if you buy what George says, and he says think safe injection sites are actually a good thing, you also think they get adopted substantially less. Because here's the difference. Democratic mayor does it in one city. City does it well. He now brings it to the party and talks about it. On their side, when it's not a Democratic mayor, he doesn't have access to the federal regime. So he can't push it back and get the expansion on it nonetheless. Thirdly, very briefly on gridlock, I think the first past the post stuff is quite important here. It explains why gridlock is likely to be far worse on their side of the house. That's to say coalition mathematics. A 5-way party council needs 3-way or 4-way agreements for a majority. So every single player means that policy side payments are likely to be extracted and are far more harder to pass, so they probably get more gridlock on their side of the house, which means infrastructural delay like the subways in Toronto gets substantially worse. There's lots of different fiscal volatility. And lastly, I just want to point out and flag very briefly, Emily tells you why corruption is better on our side of the house, because at the very least you have accountability from the party that sees you as representative of them, and you likely have reasons to stay accountable. All those reasons are broadly why we win.
Okay, some pieces of framing that are really important. I think that, guys, nobody turns out to these sorts of elections. And there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, the election is a bygone decision. 80% of the time, the Democrats are going to win. And the reason for this is just that, urban areas in the US attract young professionals who are progressive, who are college educated, who are multicultural, who come from diverse backgrounds. It is a well-known fact that urban areas vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And so in the majority of these elections, whoever wins the Democratic primary just wins. So it doesn't matter who you vote for because the Democrat will win 80% of the time. New York, Democrats have won the last elections from the last several decades before Giuliani's or whatever, right? So this is really important, right? The other thing is that people don't vote in primaries, right? People are very apathetic about the governance. They're very cynical. They don't think they can do anything because oftentimes there is a monopoly in terms of who runs these city councils. I think this is quite bad for a few reasons. The first reason is just that we agree with OO that there are voter heuristics, but we think that these voter heuristics map on to the issues on the local level quite poorly, right? So when candidates in LA, in New York, are asked about what their opinion is on the state of Israel, I literally think this matters 0% in terms of the policy outcomes for New Yorkers or for people who live in Los Angeles, right? The people are in the US today have an incredible high degree of party loyalty, which means that they will vote almost 9 times out of 10 for the Democratic candidate, regardless of the policies that they propose. And even though there's a huge diversity in the sorts of Democratic candidates which can exist, which is to say, they are not voting on the basis of information, right? They're not voting on the basis of policy. They're voting on the basis of these loyalties. How do we improve this? Okay, I think that OO is right that there are incentives to form 2 parties. There are spoiler effects. You need to create deadlock. I think even in multi-party systems, the fact that first past the post exists means that there are likely to be 1 or 2, probably two dominant parties, right? But then this is just because in order to win the mayoral election, you need to coalesce around a certain form of candidates. If you run 5 people, obviously in the next election, you're going to run 3 or 2 because candidates winning with 20% of the vote, it just doesn't work out for anyone, so people compromise, right? This is what happens in Montreal. Montreal has 2 main political parties and a few tiny, small splinter ones, and that's what we call multi-party, right? Why is this a better alternative? I think the reason is these coalitions form around local issues rather than national level ones. So whether or not you vote for Projet Montreal or L'Ensemble is determined by whether or not you support the Montreal pink metro line versus whether or not you believe in the national level, whether or not you believe in the direction of Mark Carney as a party. I think this is incredibly important, right? Because it incentivizes people to actually care about the local elections. Why is this? Because they are offered a meaningful choice, right? I think the issue with voting in Democratic primaries and the issue with Democratic elections dominating in general is that it is quite difficult to predict the sorts of policies that will come out. Even if Zohran Mamdani wins the NYC primary and then wins the general election, right? The Democratic machine is likely to change its policies and meaningfully alter them in ways that are not super compatible with what voters expected from him. Why is it different then on our side? The reason is because parties, probably 2 main political parties, have to differentiate themselves on the basis of broad issues that appeal to people, which is to say, when people turn into local level elections, they care about big budget issues, things like big public works, things like major investments, right? These are the things that make people care about local elections when there isn't a sort of national level heuristic. I think that there still is things like voter turnout. OO's response is there's no news, news is dead. I think that there are a few responses to this. First, there are things like grassroots reporting. Sometimes I get my news from Montreal blog, and there's like a lot of talented writers who do things like write on Substack and publish really important news. The other thing is that even though political parties may be slightly more amorphous, and though like they might like not have the same sorts of funding, I think they're still able to draw on things like local interests. They're still able to draw on things like partisan ads. They're still able to promote information in this way. The other thing is just that these parties become quite entrenched. The OO response to this is sometimes like they change names. I don't think this deals with like the fact that like the political coalitions that they form around are quite stable. So they're oftentimes more urban regions versus more suburban regions of the city. So even if the parties change names, the sorts of priorities that are set for the city are quite important. I'll take the PY from Emily.
Yeah, the primary reason for voter apathy is that voting seems too difficult. It's even more difficult for the few people voting when there's so much information and you don't know what the party stands for.
Guys, this is why parties like run on simple platforms, or they run on major projects, things like the Pink Line, things like major infrastructure projects. Why in like municipal politics there is a need to have sorts of flagship programs, and this makes it actually quite easy to do things like identify with things. I actually don't, and it's not really comparative. There's no identification of policy on your side. I think this also has like the downstream effect of encouraging forms of innovative investment and the new policies that O seems to care about. I think this is quite important. Okay, now let's deal a little bit more about some of the clashes. I think that in terms of like the argument about minority parties, this is just not true. And the reason for this is just that it's quite difficult for these minority parties to do things like get a shit ton of money. And also they don't have political futures because on borough councils and city councils, it's quite difficult for them to do things like pass policies. And also minorities want to support winners. People want to vote, because oftentimes these elections are first past the post. So you vote for the candidate that you think will beat the candidate you like less. So this is just not true in terms of the way these elections work. I think that also, like, guys, if we buy your stuff on the local elections thing, you can't also have like demagoguery and populism. These two things are not compatible. This is a form of like case tension. I think that these kinds of things are quite bad. I think that in the cases in which minority parties exist, they're likely to be things like regional-based parties, which is to say they represent certain boroughs that might feel like they're not being heard on city council. So in Montreal, we have things like Équipe Anjou, Équipe La Salle. And I think this means that they're able to do things like get concessions on city politics without doing things like creating a deadlock or creating ethnic tensions that like O seems to care about. I think that this is actually a good thing. Proud to propose.
I think that's speaker for that wonderful speech. MO, whenever you're ready.
All right, I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So a couple things to situate us in the round, dealing with CG just a bit, and then basically just one big argument on how this leads to greater voter turnout and why that's a good thing. So first of all, just to like give a headline for how we're different from OO focuses a lot on how you just get better policy decisions in a broad sense. We care more about voter turnout. Voter turnout is our main metric. We'll explain to you why it's important. In relation to CG, I think their framing is a little odd to say that people just don't turn out and Democrats are always going to win. There are red states, and in red states, cities tend to be red as well. And then just keep in mind, this motion applies to every single municipality. I don't think, like, small towns still have municipal governments. It's a bit of an odd point to make, and I don't intend to focus on it too long. So, and just like one last thing to deal with, like, we can still say that in the government's world, people would show up to municipalities less. Like, your job in the debate is to give a reason why, why it's irrelevant whether or not people show up. So why do municipal politics tend to be decentered? I think this is useful to get into. Because it's true, voter turnout is generally less. Lower candidate awareness. So it's like you just get less TV time, you don't have as much money, candidates tend to be unknown, they don't tend to be broadly important, and there's like, and so the actual people who are relevant to the election just tend to not have as much face. And then the second thing is there tends to be less of a sense of importance around it, because even though your municipal tax rates are going to be much more important to you than anything you could try to accomplish on the federal level, even though like, you know, even stuff like garbage collection day is probably going to affect your life a lot more than your vote on a federal level, people see wars happening or they see massive changes to investments in federal infrastructure, and it feels very important. So what does a larger, or why do larger party affiliations help counterbalance these things? So first of all, on the issue of like candidates not having screen time, you know, politics or like policies not having screen time, really simple, larger parties have a lot of money. They have both money on their own and they have access to large donor networks. This means that when you're hiring social media teams, you can afford to get that Gen Z intern who's going to be posting memes about you on Instagram. It means you can hire more staffers to answer questions for people locally and politically, or about like local things, and it means you can put your ads on TV more. You simply get more expression of these political concerns, and so people are at least aware of the candidates who exist. Without the relationship to the large party, it is just unclear why you would have nearly as much funding. And if you do have that funding, it's much more likely to be from local entrenched interests. So like, for example, large corporations which exist in that specific area, rather than ideological groupings that cover what everyone cares about. So like, we think the Democrats are better funders than just corporations or landlords in your area directly. So that's the first reason. The second reason that, or the second thing you do to account for this is you just have more engagement with tribalism. And I don't want to like feel too icky about this, that tribalism exists in politics. Politics is inherently intertwined with identity. And so when you have Democrats and Republicans showing up, there's three things I want to bring for you for why people are more likely to vote. One, like people, like it's what we were talking about earlier with like ideology is simply a useful way of grouping together what people care about. I think OO covered a similar point, so I don't want to spend it too long. But like, you can't just have parties emerge based on specific issues, which is sort of what OG talked about, because like as a government, you need to be able to govern every single aspect of society. You can't just have a party that cares about like crime rates and then like doesn't care about like garbage collection. An ideology needs to communicate to people how a party will deal with general things. And when you have the confidence of a political party, you know that the Democrats are going to apply those value judgments broadly. So you don't need to have an opinion on every single thing that this political party in your area is going to do. You don't need to be fully informed. You can say like, well, you know, the Democrats try to have a level of standardization, and so voting is good enough. Secondly, ideology, And so, sorry, the other thing I want to say is that like people just buy into politics as a way of expressing themselves, and this means that they care about who gets into office. Because notice, for a lot of people, their main political engagement is not activism. Maybe they show up to a protest, maybe they show up to Pride or something. But for most people and most voters, they're not actively like trying to like go to protests like every week or do this kind of thing. It looks at like things like what kind of Thanksgiving dinner conversations do you have? And it looks like what kind of friends do you keep in your life? Because like, you know, like I'll give a really simple example. Like as a minority, you don't want to be around people who dislike you. And so like, you know, as a queer person, if someone like says something racist, I screen them out of my life on the basis of ideology because I don't want to put myself out to the risk of like having someone harm me directly. The use of ideology for the average person is to screen out potentially problematic individuals in their life. It's like, you know, the reverse for a conservative. If someone talks in a woke way and is likely to try and discredit them or talk shit behind their back, they use ideology as a way to screen them out. And so association with political parties is actually important to people on a very basic level. You don't want to be embarrassed at the fucking dinner table because the Democrats mismanaged something in your municipality and your uncle won't stop talking about it. This is how people actually engage with things on a day-to-day basis. It becomes a lot more about like how are you perceived for being a Democrat? How does being a Democrat speak to your values? And so when these election happens, you care about having politicians who represent you effectively. You're not going to be informed well on every single issue, and we don't think this kind of like hyper-rational approach OO talks about is going to exist in most cases. What matters is the sense of accountability that you get from having people who have their identity tied to these things, and so tribalistically show up to represent the party that more or less represents their interests. What does this mean then? It means that because people are identified with their municipal parties, which simply would not happen in the other world because there is a much less clear statement of ideology and a much less identity interwoven, it means you have less voter, or it means you have more voter turnout, and also due to there being money, you have more people showing up, and this means you have more accountability to the voters who are showing up, because you have a better sense of how their interests are manifested. You have a better sense of what advertises to them well and what doesn't. And so parties themselves have a better sense of what voters need and what they care about and how they can better represent their local political tribe effectively. You also get better informing, we can just mention that briefly, you have better staffers, you have better people on the campaign, proud to
One CO, two CG, and then moving on to O. Number one, why do we weigh over CO on the most important question of the debate, which is voter turnout? I think number one on framing, I think we tell you that large U.S. cities, status quo inherently has a Democrat biased urban turnout rate, right? Which means voters in status quo are initially disaffected. They think that these big parties already occupy the large part of the political landscape. They don't feel like their vote is the tipping point for change, right? I think the biggest push from CO is that I think ideology allows for an accessible framework essentially for these politicians to build off of, to create voter appeal, right? I think three responses to this. Number one, I think that Americans know that Democrats are a big tent party, meaning that they're largely unpredictable, meaning that these municipal interests do not largely align with national interests for the sake of, largely because national interests were more concerned with foreign policy, while municipalities are concerned again more idiosyncratic issues, which kind of leads me on to my next point of response, which is that when you entrench permanent interests, that is to say, when Democratic parties try to instill party discipline or party doctrine onto these municipal parties, this leads to voter disaffection again, when people feel disincentivized to vote uniquely because there are overarching party umbrellas that make them feel that the overarching policy of the city is not going to change despite the idiosyncrasies of the city, meaning inherent infrastructure projects. I feel ultimately, ideology overshadows, I think, the idiosyncrasies of cities, which I think give voters a false perception that there isn't going to be a huge margin of change when there are very important infrastructure projects or issues of zoning that are relevant, right? I think. Number three, I think municipal incentives are idiosyncratic on the voter level. That's to say, if I support economic austerity on the federal level, it is unclear how I would vote on housing in my local district, right? So I think this is ultimately to say that I think we weigh over on CG over CO because I think we emphasize on how uniquely the impact we get on CO is how we on political platforms we get a highlighting of these very very important municipal issues that I think is more so nebulous or unable to be accessed on offside, because I think that overarching party ideology tend to dilute the idiosyncrasies of municipalities that I think local politicians try to push in status quo. I think on OG then, I think a couple of responses to their points. I think number one is that they're more efficient potentially, because probably some kind of party dilution. I think that we're going to take on a higher burden than OG. I think we're going to accept a margin of municipal deadlock. That is to say that we think that there probably is a less efficiency in decision making, but this is in exchange, I think, ultimately for more accountability. I think Audrey, briefly touched on this, which is to say three things. Number one, legitimacy not based on national success. These politicians actually have to perform well. The performance-based feedback is a positive reinforcement mechanism, as that is more community focused in terms of selecting future candidates. For example, if I see my fucking mayor being really shit, I'm not gonna vote Democrat. I'm gonna vote Democrat again because I'm loyal to my party. I'm gonna be my fucking mayor's shit. I'm gonna vote for the other mayor that's not fucking shit, And then I think number three is this bet out corruption, which is I think very very prevalent on the city level, and I think there's also bets out shitty policy making, where politicians don't care for policy making because they are assured that they would probably win because of their inherent party affiliation. I think that by reducing the confidence of these of re-election by virtue of a party association, I think we allow for a lot more accountability and status quo. I think this is how we simply weigh over OG. I think number two, on community-specific issues on localized support networks, I think we run a pretty good vertical. I think on the crisis response and personal acquaintanceship, I think that's potentially more symmetrical, under OG's framing. But I think two things then. On optics, I think number one, I think that OG tries to push that you allow for a higher margin of change when you change the narrative, right? I think Aubrey impacts this and say there's more, voter participation when there's more political political hope that you're actually going to accomplish change on a municipal level by highlighting these municipal idiosyncratic issues, right? And I think that number two, I think OG's push on, I think that front half maybe, a push on diversity. I think in both policy and candidacy, right? I think first on policy, maybe get more unique and tailored solutions. I think we go a lot more in depth into this. I think, but also Gov, I think misses weighing on likelihood, right? I think O already establishes that you actually have to pass policy to have this manifest in status quo. The likelihood that this diversity actually turns out in status quo is probably nebulous. I think, and probably less important in this debate. But I think that number two on candidacy, right? I think that openly has clashes whether institutional constraints lead to more, I think, structural discrimination in candidates. I think the weighing here is we tell you that it's more important that we shift our attention to turning individual party loyalty to individual motivation as opposed to caring about, I think, these unique demographics. Because I think that this is probably true that discrimination happens on both sides, right? Within the Democratic Party, there are people that are very rich, very clouded. Those people are probably likely to rise to the top anyway. I think that we say, it's more important, I think, a more certain impact would be that, if we're able to probably better respond to local issues more comprehensively, get more, infrastructure as opposed to broad ideology. On scale, I think we way over for a larger margin of change. We would have a better informed voter because voters are incentivized as these local issues are being highlighted, again, for the sake of their uniqueness to the city as opposed to overarching party policy, right? Yes, opening.
Your case is really marginal. So you haven't disproven the premise that broad national parties can still do local politics, but there's many more opportunity costs to local politics. They're significantly less predictable and harder for voters to understand.
I think there's an opportunity cost to any politics, right? But I think the delta of this debate is that I think that when you have individualized parties that are not affiliated on a national level, sure, there's a large opportunity cost to anything. Lobbying exists on both sides, probably get funding. The requisite to politics is not funding, because we probably get that on both sides. They're probably lobbying. There's probably individuals who are genuinely passionate about donating and such, right? But I think the delta here is I think you get a highlighting of individual competence and we get more performance checks and balances. I don't see the significant I think the margin is actually pretty clear here. I think individuals buy into acquaintanceship. I think maybe more inclined to buy into things that they view as more proximate. I think that addressing OO then really quickly, I think that one of OO's main pushes, I think, is turnout. I think that lobbying, I think, exists on both sides. We like to clash with that by saying, IPAC can probably donate to, either way, right? The party funding is not, exclusive, essentially. But, I think turnout is actually very terrible with institutional constraints because democratic predispositions allow for more progressive demographics to be more inclined to, vote for, national policy. So the delta is that these platforms, I think, on the counterfactuals, probably more focused on more local stuff, like infrastructure projects, rail lines, and intercity collaborations that they would have not cared about in their counterfactuals because they're just, leaning towards their party, right? They're just voting Democrat because they have voted Democrat for the past 20 years. I think that we generally, are able to weigh over because we have a more certain margin of change. We tell that voters are going to be more hopeful and therefore more inclined to vote. And we identify the trade-off, which is that necessarily when we care about, overarching parties, the national parties, I think, are a lot more broad and not specific to these issues that are so important, such as infrastructure and local politics. So proud to.
I thank the government whip for their wonderful speech and happy to call upon Aubrey.
A couple of years ago, New York City Mayor Eric Adams was asked what made him become a mayor, to which he said that God called on him to become a mayor, thus announcing the divine right of mayors. The problem is that mayoral politics are actually not divinely anointed by God, and they are instead incredibly drab and incredibly boring, and are so unbelievably uninteresting that the vast majority of the public does not engage with them. We've talked a lot about whether or not you get people voting for mayor and what the mayor is going to do and all of these important decisions that are going to happen. The reality of local municipal politics is that most power is centralized by city councilors, by ward representatives, and these are positions that are oftentimes part-time, that only sit for a very small number of days throughout the year, who are often voting on policy issues that the vast majority of the public doesn't care about. It's not often oh, should we expand this metro line and invest billions of dollars into it, or should we impose NIMBYism? Instead, it's often things like, should Zone 5 engage in a minor change of zoning for parts of this street to allow some level of commercial development alongside single housing development? The types of things that most people, one, don't understand, two, don't care about, and have very little to no opinion about. The problem with this is that people who know the power of city government often run to these positions for selfish reasons, so that way they can enrich themselves. For example, people who are loosely affiliated with property developers will regularly run for city council positions, knowing that they then have a vote on the types of property development that will then be allowed in a part of the city. But because these are complex, difficult things that most people don't understand, don't care about, and have no interest in caring about, these people win year over year over year, meaning that even if you have a mayor who is popular, who's going to change things, who has big ideas, they can't, because the party and group of people that need to vote in alignment with them do not have the vested interest to vote alongside the mayor. Why did I talk about this at the beginning of the speech? The first reason is because it explains a lot of the issues that you hear in the op bench. I realize that Adam's extension sounds possibly a little bit boring, because all we did was talk about why more people are going to care about voting under our side of the house. But it is more important than what we get from opening opposition. Here's why. The first reason is because what we get out of opening opposition is frankly untrue in a lot of circumstances. They make claims about how their side is going to be able to prevent gridlock from occurring, a claim that is unsubstantiated beyond saying that different political parties may have different interests in making a name for themselves and then must block each other. But it is something that is happening symmetrically under both sides of the house. They say, oh, but when slightly fewer people from low-income neighborhoods don't vote, that means that the interest of high-income people are better represented. A claim that is not really substantiated, given that the interests of high-income people may be in many ways aligned with the interests of low-income people in a variety of different instances, given that both may want to expand the amount of developments that happens within their city, given that both might want to expand the highways. There's no intrinsic reason why this is harmful. They just assert this and expect you to believe that this is true. This is true for a lot of their claims about whether or not we get good or worse governance, to the point that it is unclear why this would be a tipping point within the debate. The closest that they get is when they give some lines of analysis about why it is that their side is going to affect turnout. But I want you to note that their explanations for this are shallow. They say, but the problem with turnout is that we don't have enough information because the news only reports about crime. Curious, in a debate where we are all talking about the very hyper-nuanced specifics of the current New York City primary race that is ongoing. It is asserted that nobody talks and reports about these issues. It is not true, however. Why does Adams' extension fix these problems? The first is that in a lot of these elections that people don't care about, are uninterested in, and are currently held by people who have been winning year over year over year, this is the only mechanism to hold those people accountable. The reason being, because when you feel yourself to have a deep familial interpersonal connection with the particular political party that person is claiming to represent, you now have a vested interest to at the very least make sure that the person who runs from the side that you find yourself not affiliated with doesn't get to win for a fifth time unopposed. It means that you may run in the primary for the party that you claim to represent, because at the very least there is an actual credible challenge. When we compare this to the multi-party system that nobody has any care about and nobody is particularly engaged with and nobody cares about the work because it's not well paying and it's very part-time and you have to keep your full-time job anyway, meaning that you can't take on this additional responsibility in a lot of circumstances, what you see is fewer people participate in democracy and you get fewer democratic outcomes. On this basis, we are better able to show that while turnout is currently bad under both sides of the house, it gets worse under their side. And here's why I talk about the Gov bench, right? Because the Gov bench, first of all, makes a very weird mistake in this round, which is that they don't recognize that small political parties can and do run under both sides of this debate. We prefer that there are mainstream political parties that are affiliated with the Democrats, but there is nothing stopping other small political parties from being involved in the system and doing literally every single thing that government bench wants them to do. We've seen this in, for example, Burlington, Vermont, where a certain independent candidate by the name of Bernie Sanders won against mainstream Democratic candidates and became mayor about 30 years ago, right? He is the most prominent example. He is not the only example. Government bench has given you no exclusive reasons for why it is only in a multi-party system that has no affiliations to the Democrats, because
our side is multi-party as well, as seen born in status quo, that their side is the only one to get these pressures, I would just insert analysis that we would traditionally see in multi-party democracies about how small parties can push the interests forward. The second issue with their claim on GovBench is that a lot of there are internal mechanisms in all these parties to deal with all of the issues that they suggest. They say, oh, but there's going to be too much pressure for the mainstream party. There are primaries that account for this. They say, oh, but our side is going to get to focus on localized issues. Our side does this too. Why does our case win the round? Because truthfully, no side has been able to tell you why, one, good governance matters, and two, why good governance happens. On our side, we are at least able to tell you why turnout happens, which means that it becomes prior to, quite literally, every other claim that happens in the debate. Because we have democracy, not because we think that there's a specific outcome that ought to occur, because ultimately speaking, that is why we have the will of the people and want there to be an aggregation of preferences. So it doesn't matter whether or not a policy that is passed is more progressive or not. Some people may be conservatives in this room, right? But when it has fewer people participating in it, it means that there are fewer opinions involved in the decision-making process, and it means it is less accountable. I'm very proud to oppose.
I think that's speaking for the wonderful speech.
Cool. So, Greg, wait, are you recording?
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So I've got OOOG COCG.
Alex?
I have the same call.
Okay. I have a different call.
Okay.
I think that the first is OO, the second is CG, the third is OG, and the fourth is CO. So it sounds like we have some things sorted out. Let's start with the top half. So, Greg, can you explain to me why OO beats OG?
Yeah, I think.
And I will say, just sorry, before you start, two quick notes. First, I think that because of the amount of content in the round, it would be helpful to organize it into policy making and electoral dynamics. And the second thing is if you could explain more on what you think OG already does, because I think that will become important against CG. So if you could focus on OG and not on OO.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So why I have OO beating OG, but
Yeah.
specifically, I guess, what OG fails at.
Exactly.
Then. Okay. I think OG basically just fails at, I guess, for me, is why the big, I guess, bureaucracy levels of things are a problem. And I think most importantly, why then that the smaller parties solve this issue. Essentially, I get that the cities have specific problems and that the large parties may not address those problems. And yet I don't see why in the world that would happen, given that it's the city's problem. And while they fall under the big umbrella, I'm unclear as to why nothing won't happen, because the mayor, I think, like OO says, needs to be liked by its populace. And so at some point, OO says things will get done, but then OO then brings up all of the things about voter turnout, and I guess the idea of so much information and not enough means to get it. You then don't really access anything different, and I find OG does not properly, I guess, respond to that, because all they really say, at least from what I can tell, is that they'll operate on the basis of identity. People will be split up because you have so many parties that everyone needs their own thing, but it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so two things I want to push back on and hear your thoughts on. So the first thing is within this broad case on the fact that there is an identity, like that there's a wholesale and that we want to splinter it off so you can protect more issues. I guess the charitable read towards OG here is that they do have an explanation which says in the PM, you don't want the mayor to do specifically the best policy for the town in that field where it contrasts with the general wholesale agenda of the party, because you care more about the nation than you do about that
Right.
specific city. So you'd rather not have contradictions between your party than you would what's best for the city. That's my first thing that I want to hear your thoughts on. The second thing is I do think OG has some other directions, even if they're less central. So the fact that, for example, you gravitate towards identities as a form of like policy-making problem if you have competition between many small splinters of the party. And secondly, the fact that you have the problem of backing a candidate as the party, which then means that it's very hard for multiple different candidates to compete. So if you could first answer those two new directions, and then we'll get back to the first.
I think the first one on the mayor doing best for the party, not the people, I find it, I guess, somewhat more unsubstantiated in that intuitively you have to do what you need to do to get elected, even if your party status might be at risk. It's better if you're elected, because if you're not elected, you're not in the party anymore. And so when I think about it, the way my decision making would work, that's how I see it, and I don't see where else they have this kind of thought process. And if you could just repeat the second question, sorry.
Yeah, so my second question is just about the other directions from opening government that aren't about this splintering off. So first, opening government has the claim that you gravitate towards identity if you don't have a lot of like the fact that big parties tend to pin each other one against another more than you do on opening opposition, which is the end of the prime minister. And the second claim I want you to mention is the fact that there's less room for multiple candidates that might be more qualified because the party backs one of them over others. So there's a nepotistic race where the candidate is not necessarily a qualified one.
Not quite sure what you want me to comment on, sorry.
Why don't you think these arguments work?
Oh, I think the second argument at least doesn't quite work because it's very similar to, I guess, the two-party system where the nepotism ends up playing out, to me at least, virtually identical, where at some point you just have a coalition of either Democrats or Republicans, or your 5 different parties backing some other party. So I don't see it as meaningfully different. I guess really, now that you mention it, I guess the first one does make a lot more sense, but I don't think they don't do it, if that makes sense as well.
Yeah. Okay. So just to clean up the discussion a little bit, I do think you're right that the backing argument doesn't work for the simple reason that opening opposition mentions there's a money problem in fielding in being a candidate in an election. So that is to say, opening opposition actually extracts a margin here by saying that money is a constraint on either side. So those that the parties don't like anyway won't be platformed. The difference is that occasionally parties like more competent people over those that have more money. In those cases, party funding is able to platform those more competent candidates. So this is an 0-0 flip. So back really to the main argument, which I agree with you. I just want to clear out those OG arguments. Back to the main thing that OG says on the wholesale package. I want to push back in one more way, and I'll have Alex respond to this, which is I do think that like the mayor incentive, whether or not they lose the election, is irrelevant, because I think OG is fair to frame that the mayor oftentimes gets direct approval or direct commands from the top party. And I don't think OO contests the characterization that the mayor is very much commanded by the central party. So if that's true, why don't we have a problem where the mayor does things that are worse for the city? Alex.
Sorry, you're asking from OG to explain why these mayors won't make bad decisions for voters.
So what Greg's response to the idea from opening government that you can deviate, the idea from opening government that you can't deviate from what your party wants most on the national level in order to do better policy for the city. His response is the fact that mayors still have their own incentives because they want to get elected next time. Mm-hmm. So my pushback to this is I think opening government does explain, to no contestation from opening opposition, that the party does have command over the mayor. So what do you think is still the reason that opening government's argument on this wholesale policies problem doesn't work?
You asked me to defend opening government?
I'm asking you why you think that this argument, given that you also have opening opposition beating opening government, why is it that opening government's argument on the fact that you advance policies that aren't best for the city because you appeal to the national interest of the party, why does that not defeat opening opposition?
Oh, I see. Right, I think opening opposition symmetrizes this by explaining how on the most clear issues where you're going to get like coalition supports and like obvious issues, like if everyone is clearly supporting and targeting the key issues that government talks about, like different cities having different main priorities, it seems symmetrically in the interest that they would push for that. And it's not really clear in which cases the like federal level party would have a disagreement with the
Yeah.
local party.
So that's very fair. I think, first of all, opening government really has an extent problem here, where they don't explain why there's such a vast disagreement. I think the best idea we have is progressives versus conservative measures that a city administration has to take. I
Yeah.
think the best response here is from the DLO that actively flips this by just explaining why you still have, in many cases, a first past the post system. In those cases, it is actually much worse because now you only appeal to progressives or only appeal to conservatives, in which case you eliminate the ability to be flexible towards any policy at all. So I actually think that this flip on the on policy flexibility being even smaller with a first past the post system means that your opening opposition is able to take out this OG claim. Are we cool then with opening opposition over opening government?
Yeah.
Nice. Closing half. I'll start. So CG is probably the team we have the most disagreement on. So I agree CG is confusing. I'm going to start by explaining my read for why CG is above OG, and then I'll let you guys push back. I think that CG has a lot of additions in rebuttal that fulfill many of the burdens that OO attacks OG on, even though they're disparate additions. So the first thing that I think closing government does, and I think this is the most important addition that they have, is to explain why party loyalty in many cases means that even the perfect information that opening opposition talks about isn't enough, because it doesn't matter if you're informed. In many cases, you still vote for whatever party you support most because of your historical allegiance to that party. This does not get explained as deeply in OG. The reason that is important is because now that opening opposition is beating opening government on the fact that the electoral dynamic is so skewed because you don't have information, opening government's benefits in terms of the fact that you can have more policies or whatever sort of depend on proving that the electoral system selects who is best for the city to begin with. Because it doesn't matter if you have flexibility of the terms of policies that you're able to advance if the candidate selected isn't who's best for the city. So I think here, by explaining first that there is a similar problem in opposition in the way that you select candidates because of the fact that you have this party loyalty going on. Second, by explaining why many times people are disengaged also on their side because of party loyalty. And third, by having better responses than opening government to the information problem and explaining why there are ways to disseminate information, I think closing government muddies the waters much more than opening government on the question of whether voting is done accountably or not. Do you guys think this is fair, or do you have pushbacks on why it's something that OG does or that CG doesn't do well here?
I think my main initial reason is that I had OG over CG is because CG was focusing on engagement, but it wasn't clear to me why the engagement mattered more than what policy direction these politicians would focus on. And so I think OG is proving some margin, not only to just say that to push back on the party whipping stuff, but specifically that you would shape parties around single issues, which, of course, as I said, OO symmetrizes to an extent, but that was the reason, because it seemed like as long as the party was shaped on the correct issue, then voter engagement was secondary to that.
Yeah, okay, that's very fair. I think the reason that I do not weight that as higher as a few things that get mentioned explicitly in the government whip. So the first is that closing government does have an addition. Arguably, I think it's better than opening government, but I feel like it's fine. I don't know if I'm not convinced of this. I think closing government's idea on the incentive to prioritize small policies and small issues is better than opening government's explanation. Because closing government says that your reason to want to prioritize small policies as a local party is because you want to stand out. Whereas the main attack that opening opposition has towards opening government is that you stand out through identity, or you stand out through bad stuff. So this fills an important burden in OG for why you actually use the greater policy flexibility that you have. The second thing is that I think government whip weighs well why even if we believe OG is winning on better policies, the margin on that, given that, as we mentioned, it's not clear why you always have the dissonance between what the party wants to do and what the leader wants to do. It's more important that for every single candidate, you get a better election of the candidate and a more representative election of that candidate. So these are my two reasons for placing CG over. Greg, do you want to push back?
For the bench.
Can you explain the second weighing metric again?
Yeah, so we agree that the party dissonance thing between the leader and the general party first happens in specific cases. Second is effectively flipped by opening opposition when they explain, and this isn't just, I'm not putting in OO. This is an actual missing thing in OG. It's not clear why a small party doesn't also just represent a specific group and is not willing to deviate from that group. And so this explanation is lacking. CG's explanation for why first you prioritize the city-specific things fills that to some extent, but even if not, it at least their explanation about why the voters are more representative, the voters make a more representative choice of their interests, at least doesn't fall into the same burden problem that OG does, and happens for every single election, not just the cases in which there's a dissonance between the party and the candidate. What do we think?
I think I would agree with you right now, unless Alex wants to.
I'm looking through my notes. I think, like, when the PM happened, I kind of took their characterization for granted because it seems intuitive that, like, these parties would focus on it. But when you point out that op questions what parties will actually focus on, also OG does run a case about, like, they literally say it, that they'll, like, run on race, right?
Yeah.
But then Andrew knifes this later, which is a little weird. But yeah, I guess it was a little asserted on what exactly they would run on.
Yeah, I agree completely. I also think the PM's case sounds quite internally sound, but this is one of the main things I was thinking about during CG, whether or not the OO attack is something we can insert into the GovBench comparison. And I do think that they direly lack a comparative on why even if you're bound to a wholesale platform, why are you not bound to a too specific of a platform on their side? I think this is an internal burden that's fair to insert here.
Do you think it counts as an incentive that OG proves when they talk about how municipal changes can spearhead federal changes, or is that just an effect if they do it to begin with?
Yeah, so you're talking about the research-based stuff, right? Like the fact that you implement policies and know more about that. So I think that's interesting. The problem with this argument and the way I think OO flips it is that it's not actually clear why you have an incentive to be experimental.
Yeah.
Like it presumably, as OO say, you actually just want to be as mainstream as you can. And it's not clear why parties can't also implement experimental things. And in fact, when they do, it's better, as OO says, because you disseminate it across the party. Anyway, point is just that, like, it's this experimental margin doesn't sound massive.
Second pushback, I think OG characterizes that there are key clear issues specific to each city that are just obvious. So New York, it's just like, it's the subway, like cleanliness, or like the other examples that were there. Does characterizing the problem make it then clear that there's like a clear pressing issue that a specific party would obviously center around?
Yes, but the problem in that case is I think it's still false to what we said before, which is that it still sounds incidental. Like, this characterization could be true, but it's still true for specific cities over others. And I think the second problem is that OG kind of assumes this isn't widespread, right? Because if it's widespread, it's not clear why it doesn't make and change the party platform. So they have to assume that this only happens in specific cities. But I think more strongly, I do again just come back to the fact that this doesn't explain why it is better to only focus on this one thing, or only push forward a specific agenda when it comes to this one thing.
So, like, what do you think is, so from OG, you're not sure of what these small parties will represent, and you think it could potentially be like special interests which aren't in the interest of the people. Correct. Generally. It's an absent opening opposition, so you just didn't think OG like proved that policy would generally be like good for people.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that the way CG fills this is because they don't go through the party track to explain why small parties are better. Sure. They go through the voter track to explain why selection is better.
Can you explain the CG case quickly?
Yeah, so we do need to wrap up because we need to talk about CO in a second. Yeah. But the CG idea is both negative and positive. So the positive part is to explain why many times the historical allegiance that OO admits characterizes these parties means that you don't deviate from them even if they don't represent your interests.
Yeah, that's good.
And then there's the thing about why you do get information, which responds to OO.
Right. Cool. I'm fine to flip on that.
Are we? Yeah. Nice. Let's talk about closing opposition. So do we all have closing opposition still losing to top half and CG?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's good. I think that means we're very close to consensus. Let's go through why that is. So Greg, what do you think CO adds?
I think.
Wait, I can do a little pushback in favor of CO from what I wrote before.
Oh, okay.
1 second. Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the things that CO adds, I guess, I hope it. I don't think it's. I guess it's from the whip where all like small parties can run on both sides. I think that's one of the things that they add. Would you think that is not derivative, but since it's from whip, I think.
No, I'm gonna be so
Yeah.
real. I think this is literally the only thing they say that's new.
Yeah,
including
that's why
responses.
I'm asking.
The reason that, like, yes, of course they can add a response. I just think that the problem with that response is that it's like you do know that people said things before you. Like CG's idea is you have historical party allegiance, which this doesn't respond to. And that explains why even if you could have competitors, you don't have competitors because of historical party allegiance. For OG, it's a little more implicit, but I also think that OG has the idea of like, you often have a congregation of resources, or the candidate that the party backs is the one that you know is going to win, so everyone strategically votes based on this. So I think there are implicit responses in each of the Gov team's cases, and I don't think this response then takes it down.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we have any more pushback on CO? So you said, Alex, you said you have something?
Yeah, I don't know if this is what we just talked about, but CO was just saying like you get accountability in primaries because people pay attention. Is this just uncomparative because it's like?
I just think CO is like, hi guys, there's a turnout problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but like how does that change? That's the answer is like I have no idea what CO thinks changes. Like thank you for explaining to me that primaries are disinteresting. Now what do we do about that? Who knows? I guess their attempt is to say that you have special interests that's pushed because people are so disinterested that there's a lot of corruption that happens in mayoral elections. And then their intuitions like, it's better if it's done through mainstream parties because the mainstream parties' reputation, this is how I understand it from the whip. The main party's reputation is a strong incentive to counter this nepotism and corruption. I just don't know why they want to. Like if no one's interested in it, as CO says, then why aren't they nepotistic even in large established parties?
The MO is like you have more money to run ads. You can hire Gen Z interns to make reels.
This is all DLO.
Yeah.
All.
Yep.
So I feel that this part of CO that's new is extremely uncomparative. Cool. So are we happy with CO under?
Mm-hmm.
Nice. We can then do speaks. Unless you guys have anything else.
No.
Okay.
Great.
Opening opposition. Do we have a preference between the two speakers?
I think Adam's case was more sophisticated in analysis.
I agree. I think I do. I think they're both was very good. I think that the ideas on the difference in capacity to have campaign managers and people that do good policy and think tanks, etc., affects both policy and electoral dynamics. And I think it was very smartly explained what is the delta between small parties and large parties.
Mm-hmm.
So I lean towards a slight DLO. So I'm going to read a bracket. Tell me if it makes sense. Where did the bracket disappear? Arguments address core issues of the debate, have strong explanations which demand a strong response, may occasionally fail to fully respond to very well-made arguments. Yep.
Yeah.
I think we are in the middle of this bracket for DLO, so we could go 84 and 80 and one under for the LO, so 83.
Yeah.
Great, sounds good. Closing government, do we have a preference?
Not really, no.
I have a strong preference for MG. I think that government whips like Wang's were fine, but the responses were quite poor or derivative of the MG. And I think that the MG does a lot of responsive content quite well. So, do we think there's a drop from opening opposition? Significant drop?
I think it's a bracket under.
Yes. So I agree. I think arguments are relevant to address core issues in the debate, well made without obvious logical gaps, may be vulnerable to good responses. So do we want the middle end of that or upper end of that, i.e. 81 or 82?
81, I would say.
I think it's in the middle. It's like an 80 at best.
I'm not sure. I think 81, also I don't want to go too down for open government, and I do think there's a margin between the two speakers, so I would also lean 81. So for government whip, do we want to go 1 under or 2 under? They're both in the same bracket.
Yeah.
It's just
I'd say 7. I was 81, 79.
yeah, I tend to agree. Okay, opening government. So to reflect closeness, we'll probably want to have this be a 1 speak margin. Do we have a preference?
I had Andrew, just on, I think, responsiveness to a strong LO.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the responses were great, I'm not gonna lie. I think that the part of the speech that is good is the experimentation and research stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I'm happy with a pair.
That's fine with me.
Yep.
That would though mean that we have to go 79, 79.
Yeah, that's okay.
We could also go 80 for Gov Whip and give them both 80s.
Either way works. I'm not.
I think we can be generous. I think Gov Whip had some good wings.
Okay.
So then we'll go 80 for both OG speakers. Closing opposition. Wow, drop. Adam and then Ethan, do we have a preference?
I think Ethan was doing good weighing.
Of OO over Govs, yes.
Yes.
I guess a 1 speak margin. I don't like the let's just pretend the round didn't happen sort of rebuttal. So I do think this is a 1 speak margin at best. So I'll read a bracket. Arguments are almost exclusively relevant to address most of the core issues. Occasionally you may slip into deficits and explanation, clear to follow and thus credit. Sounds good?
Yeah.
So we'll have lower end of that,
Yes.
which is a 76 for Adam and a 77 for Ethan. Does that sound fine, or do you want to go even 1 lower, 75, 76?
I think that's fine.
I think 76, you mean? Or 75?
76, 77.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
sounds good. Cool, we
Great.
have a ballot. George with an 80, Emily with an 83, Andrew with an 80, Adam with an 84, Aubrey with an 81, Ashlyn with an 80, Adam with a 76, and Ethan with a 77.
Sure.
Great.
Nice. Cool, thank you all.
Well done. What'd you think of the round? That was good.
I think, yeah, that was
Very good round, but very fast.
very fast, yes, a lot of content.
Hard to flow.
Oh, very.
Awesome.
I had a 0.5.